Hello and welcome to our, what would you say, regular webinar series, Emotional Intelligence and Innovation. And we're looking at the four dimensions of the Transformational Leadership Model that is found within the Emotional Quotient Inventory Leadership Report. And if you're not familiar with the report or the EQI, it's absolutely fine. You'll be very familiar with many of the concepts that we'll be discussing during our webinar today, and lots of opportunity to ask questions, etc. So I'm here with my work colleague, Jill Corey.
Hi everyone, good morning.
And we're gonna take a look at this concept of innovation and look at the relationship with emotional intelligence. We like this slide, this idea that the world needs dreamers and the world needs doers, but above all, the world needs dreamers who do. And what I think is interesting about that is that it speaks to the two notions that we're going to be that are here. One of which is creativity, which is simply having the dream or having the great new different idea, but the other is actually the application. How does it actually get implemented? And that's the doing part, and that's innovation, is the application of a new idea.
There is so much information about innovation, and we just want to say our own focus today is really about looking at what emotional intelligence qualities support people to actually take action in an innovation. So move from idea to innovation, it requires certain qualities, and some of those that are highlighted are emotional intelligence skills or competencies, and that's really our focus. So we're not going to open up the conversation to innovation in its largest, well, in how we understand innovation from a development perspective, but just as an emotional intelligence dimension.
So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk about the EQ model of leadership, and of course also the EQ model at the same time. We'll talk about what we mean by innovation. And some of the key qualities of innovation. We get a chance to talk with groups of people in workshops and programs where we get a lot of discussion around what innovation actually is, how it actually looks in the real world. And so it's led us to think a lot about this concept and have some different perspectives on it. We'll look at how innovation is related to leadership. And finally, what are some of the key EI competencies when it comes to innovation? And we know that from empirical research, so we'll share that with you as well. So this is the model of emotional intelligence that we use. If you Google emotional intelligence, there's dozens of models, and this was one of the first models out there. It is an updated version, but it was originally created by Dr. Reuven Bar-On and then updated by MHS, which is Multi Health Systems, which is the largest publisher of psychometrics in Canada. And they've put a lot of money and research into this model and making sure that it holds up empirically and that it has high usability. So, I mean, clients really relate to the model. They like knowing in what areas they have strengths and in what areas perhaps are opportunities for development for them. And this is what we use in our coaching work with managers.
One of the things that we really appreciate about this model is that although it's an extensive and comprehensive report that people get, there attached to that are so many recommendations for development. So it's not a tool that just gives a kind of a profile. It really shows people where development is possible and gives some ideas for development. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's so useful in coaching, is it really offers people an opportunity to see how they're currently functioning and whether their emotional intelligence is high or whether it's derailing some of their other strengths and processes. What
MHS did was they wanted to really relate the model to a model of leadership, and they looking at various models of transformational leadership, they came up with these 4 dimensions, and they found a tool that roughly approximates scores in these various areas, correlated it with the EQI, and created this model. And so we actually know which are the top 6 EQ competencies which correlate with each of these 4 dimensions. And we have covered the other 3 dimensions and in previous webinars. And today, of course, we're looking at innovation. So what is innovation? I just saw this, this little meme on the internet, and I liked it. Once again, it's not just about having great ideas, it's about making ideas happen. So there is something about implementation in the word innovation. Let's look at this list here. So innovate with, thinking a lot and talking a lot about innovation with people, we realize that innovation is change, and change is scary. Change upsets organizations. We deal with lots of organizations, Jill, where people have trouble dealing with and struggling with change.
Yeah, and yet at the same time, as the emotional intelligence tool shows us, when people score high in certain areas, they actually embrace and love change and look forward to it. And when we work with organizations who are in that frame of mind and have created that culture, it's a very exciting place to be, and people are really engaged and committed to the organization. And so when people get excited about change, they're looking to alter and think about what can we do better, either for customer, for the culture of our organization, for social innovation. How do we make our culture better? And certainly these days, that's on the minds of lots of people. Sometimes it's dramatic transformation versus just altering aspects of a product or a practice. It steps outside conventions, and I think that's an important part of innovation. It's very easy to get trapped and into habituated ways of doing the work that you do. And we love the idea of being unconventional. It is the thing that leads to joy for people and expansive workplaces.
And variety is the spice of life, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. So innovation, as I've referenced, is both social and economic. It's often in innovation, I think we think more from a business perspective or an economic bottom line perspective. What's better, what's more efficient. But really, innovation has its roots very often from social innovation. It's more than just here's a great idea, as we've been saying, but it's about finding, testing, implementing, and a whole process around that. So of course you need people who have ongoing commitment to the project, that it's not a one-off, and it's probably not a short-term either idea that's being implemented, or the implementation itself is often long-term. We've said alteration, it's also adaptation, which really is both organizationally and individually, requires an adaptation to both change and, again, thinking outside the normal parameters of work processes. And evolution, sometimes these are not massive transformations, but just an evolutionary change, people doing what makes sense, doing the next right thing. And from that, there's an evolution, and maybe you can think in your own organization of examples of that. What it requires is fearless, independent people. So, of course, we know that risk aversion, and risk focus is part of innovation. You cannot easily bring innovation into an organization if you don't have leaders who embrace risk and see the opportunity in risk, which is somewhat connected to a growth mindset.
Yeah, that last one there, of course, comes from Carol Dweck's book Mindset, and her ideas about a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. So innovation is connected to learning, and it is about growing, learning, development, etc. So those are some of our thoughts on what innovation is. We also thought, noticed chat, I would add a freedom and openness to failing. Absolutely.
Yes.
And thank you. And we are going to make reference to that coming up here shortly. Our next slide is, well, we saw this quotation again, looking around on the internet for ideas around innovation. This fellow was with Procter and Gamble his whole career. Pete Foley, he calls himself a serial innovator. He has over 100 patents to his name, and so he's got some credibility with respect to talking about innovation. He said, big ideas take time. Productive failure, communication, and collaboration. These are enabled by a culture that protects and to some degree nurtures big ideas and innovative, fearless people. And what I like about that is that reference to culture, a culture that encourages ideas and idea generation, and encourages and supports innovation, whereas some cultures actually don't so much, which is unfortunate.
I also think it's very important what he points to in collaboration, and we will talk a little bit more about that later. But I think culturally we have an idea that somebody's sitting in their office and they come up with this big idea and they implement and they're a genius. But in fact, I'm trained as a sociologist, and there's a whole field of sociology of knowledge that shows how transformation takes place over a kind of global and time span, that when somebody gets to the actual invention or innovation, it's backed up by like many people from many different parts of the world sharing knowledge and information that leads that person to innovate in that way. So I think it just helps to transcend this notion of the genius in the closet, just kind of ticking away 18-hour days. And yes.
Well, and that's the traditional notion of the leader too, right, Jill? I mean, the individual who, you know, shuts themselves away in the office and then comes out with the big idea or the big solution or whatever, the big innovation for the company.
Yeah, and I like that you point to leadership here, because in some ways, if any of you are kind of thinking at the same time about your own work context, you'll have some idea of what an innovative leader looks like. And it is one who reaches out, who's engaged and is engaging and is always listening for people and their ideas, which is, again, what Pete Foley talks about, communication and collaboration. And I think the person who made that statement earlier about openness, like freedom to fail, the idea that failure is part of success is a really important one that we talk about in our leadership courses, that is success, to create that environment.
Mm-hmm. We thought it's important to think about what innovation is not, and I don't know if any of you can relate. If you can, type into the chat box. But that phone there, my aunt had on her farm one of these phones, and it was on a party line. And so you crank the crank at the side of the phone, and then you never knew who was on the line. And so I mean, it speaks to the incredible innovation. I mean, now we have these computers in our pockets and in our backpacks that we can hold in our hands, which have all this incredible information at our fingertips, and so it's interesting to think that this is not change for the sake of change. It's not like, okay, so we must innovate and then we just change the design of our coffee cups or whatever just because it's time to change. It's never easy, is it, Jill?
Yeah, you know, I was actually thinking more about that change for the sake of change. It's true, and again, we'll talk a little bit about disruptors, and sometimes we have negative disruptors, and that is where there's just ongoing change, and people in the organization actually feel so demoralized by it that it's not change that's attached to some kind of new vision that leads people to engage and commit and feel passionate about it. Sometimes just feels like there's constant change without clarity about its purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Innovation is not easy. It's not simple. It's not quick. And so, you know, the idea that we're going to have a team meeting, we're going to come up with some innovations, might not be the most realistic goal.
Right. So it may not be a scheduled
Right.
activity.
Yeah. Monday morning, we're going to innovate. It's not inconsequential. It's not non-critical, and it's not a nice to have. It's a need to have. We all need to constantly innovate, and so we either do that with intention, or we do that. You know that necessity is the mother of invention. And I know you have another version of that.
Our women's leadership group has come up with a slightly more colored version of that, but we'll keep it clean here.
Yes, the mother of invention. Yes. Okay, so carrying right along, I saw this and it made us both laugh. Disruption so hot right now. Disruption is a buzzword. It is hot right now. The cool thing to do is to disrupt an industry, and I guess we just wanted to be a bit critical of the word disruption and the ideas that come with it, and say that actually disruption, you know, as a goal, or if that's an activity you're going to be involved in, that can be overwhelming for people. And I think one of the things that are misunderstood are that if an idea existed before, your idea may not be disruptive. And some people talk about disruption and Uber in the same breath. Well, hiring people to drive you around in their car is not a disruptive idea. There may be other aspects of Uber that were disruptive, but more you could talk about the disruption of Netflix, where they actually had a very different idea, which actually transformed an industry. And I guess I just want to encourage the downplaying of the term disruption. And say, actually, what our goal is not to disrupt an industry, but to make a better product or make a better service or think more about our customers and clients. I think that's probably what we want to do.
Well, and again, looking back to the historical root of disruption, it has its roots in social transformation and cultural transformation. So the reason that we're particularly interested in this is that in kind of providing a critique to it, is that these are the social disruption of racism, of economic difficulties. It's a bigger process than business, and I think just again we want to point to that. It can be in any context, workplaces, cultures, services, products. But these days, I think what's happening globally is going to require some significant evolution, if not disruption, of human rights practices and kind of how we're treating our planet. And as we look out today on our Vancouver day and see snow falling, we wonder how much of this is climate change. And
Thanks, Andy. That was actually one comment that was made in an article that we read about disruption, is that disruptors don't set out to disrupt. They start with an idea for growth that sometimes ends up disrupting an industry. Absolutely. And as Jill mentioned, you know, some things could stand to be disrupted. Again, social change, for example. Okay, carrying right along, I came across this cartoon which we thought was funny. So the old white guy says, instead of risking anything new, let's play it safe by continuing our slow decline into obsolescence. And that made us laugh, and we use that as a bit of an introduction to an exercise that we do in some of our workshops and courses, where we talk about you know, what are things that people say which actually build or do that actually builds innovation, and what are the things that people do and say that actually kill innovation. Do you want to talk about this one, Jill?
Sure, but
yeah.
we want to hear from people here. What are some of the things you hear in your organization that either invites or kind of clamps down on innovation or risk?
Yeah, you'll notice that I chose for pictures the old white guys for innovation killers, and the young millennials for innovation builders, and of course let's use that loosely. I don't want to stand behind that particular generalization.
Being an old white guy yourself.
Oh, we've always done it this way. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aurelia. It's absolutely something that you hear. And interestingly, when I started many years ago on my own, and then began to add people to the team, and so people would ask, well, why are you doing it that way? And my response was, well, I've always done it this way. I never really thought about doing it any other way,
Yeah.
but now that you mention it, absolutely, we can do it better. Great idea. We'll have the management team evaluate that. Now, is that an innovation killer or an innovation builder? Jason.
It's a killer.
Takes the idea away from the person with the passion for the innovation.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's an innovation killer. Yeah, we'll take that away. How about this? How about we'll get back to you on that? Psychological safety, critical for innovation. Absolutely, Maynard. Thank you. Yeah, psychological safety has been a term that's come up throughout the 90s. Harvard Business Review did some articles on, and someone, I can't remember her name, wrote a book on psychological safety. And it is now a bit of a business buzzword as well. So we don't all think that that's a great thing, but
and all we mean by that is that there's this new there's a new requirement to balance risk, personal risk, and business and cultural risk with safety. And so my work is in the area of violence against women, so I'm the first to put safety first. But I also was on a team of men and women for quite a long time. And when the women wanted to make change in the organizational practices, we were providing support to women with experiences of abuse and treatment for men who were abusive. And the male therapists didn't like to be challenged. They didn't like their paradigm to be challenged. And what it took for them was a capacity to put somebody else besides their own psychological safety first. And that was, in this case, so obvious, to put women's safety before their sense of getting feedback or being challenged on their practices. So I think there's this really interesting balance that we need to talk about, is when are we using psychological safety to make sure that workplaces are not bullying places, are not harassment places, where people are safe to say, to call power out when it's necessary, and when are we hiding behind that because we don't want to have feedback or get difficult messages back to us. And so I think you've raised, and thank you for raising that concept of psychological safety. It's important in this context that we think through that and make sure that we're actually distinguishing between what is just something that I don't want to hear, so I'm going to call up safety on it, and what is actually critical to feel safe enough to be innovative and to be creative, and not to feel harassed or under pressure.
Let's look at what the women in one of your groups said, Jill. You review the flip chart for us.
Well, sure. So you see on the left side under Innovation Builders, this is from the Heart and Science of Leadership for Women, one of our courses, that safety and trust are really important in order to have not just innovation, but to feel creative enough and then safe enough to express different new ideas. Time, you can hear that on both the killer side and on the builder side. We don't have time. There's no resources for that on the innovation killer side. But having time, as we've said before, these innovations take time and some patience, and that means you need the commitment of leaders to really follow an idea to its development end. A healthy company, yeah. And be able to disconnect from some of the regularly scheduled work. And then this notion of discord or dis-ease, where there's something really uneasy going on. Sometimes you need that adversity or just tension to really push for change. While on the other side, complacency can be one of the killers. If things are going well enough, there might not be enough of a call to actually make like feel like you want to have a look and see where you could make a change. And then this notion of being risk adverse, for sure. Killers, if people don't feel comfortable, again, in that kind of maybe psychological safety or workplace safety.
Well, there's fear of sanctions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So obviously you can see some of the lack of alignment. I think that's an important one when somebody introduces a project, but it's not aligned with either personal or company values. That can be a killer. It's like, well, that's not the mission that I understood the organization to be about. And it's very hard to get buy-in when that happens.
Thanks, Andy, for pointing out that it was Amy Edmondson who wrote that book on psychological safety. And even innovations that survive to execution phase sometimes don't manage to navigate the political environment in large enterprise, enabling really good ideas to see the light of day. The app we're using right now, Zoom, absolutely.
Yeah.
The creator of Zoom tried to get his ideas to fly in Cisco and it was not successful. And so here we are, with this great new company and this great new product and service. So thanks, Andy, for that. Let's press on and let's look at this slide, innovation and leadership. Innovative leaders are visionary and courageous. They set the tone for the organization for creativity. So whether an organization is creative or not, I think you can point to the leadership of the organization. Does that leadership encourage and create the environment for innovation to take place? Do they value mistakes? Do they have a growth mindset? And do they encourage collaboration? This idea of inspiration. Can you imagine innovation without inspiration?
Right.
And motivation, motivating others to take chances, think outside the box through their actions. This idea, again, we talked about it already, willing to take risks. Is it safe to take risks? Make and acknowledge mistakes. And this is about leaders. This is about leaders who make and acknowledge their own mistakes, who make the mistakes themselves and say, okay, I made a mistake, instead of the pretense or the blaming or the silicon, idea where they always get away with stuff, and try again. And they support that approach in others. Just a few thoughts about innovation and leadership.
We love that you're all using the chat box. Keep sending us your thinking.
So we know what the top 6 EQI competencies that correlate with the innovation dimension of leadership are. And they are self-actualization, independence, problem-solving, assertiveness, flexibility, and optimism. And we've covered some of these quite thoroughly in other webinars. And so we're going to be selective about this. And we are going to start with problem-solving. And
I do want to just say the first one, self-actualization, in the context of EQ competencies, it's not as much about achievement as it is about doing things that are meaningful and purposeful.
yes.
And so that, I think, sets up and frames for us innovation.
Yes.
And who you are as an innovator. It's that you are always looking for things that align with your values, that have meaning and purpose, not just for you, but for others as well.
Mm-hmm. If you're not in the right role, doing the right things that have, a sense of fulfillment for you, you're absolutely going to be less innovative. Whoops. Okay.
As we've said before about the EQ competencies, the problem solving itself is not an emotional intelligence. It's not an emotion, but it requires a great deal of emotional intelligence to be effective at problem solving. So when we include all the data, both our cognitive data and our emotional data, we are more able to make excellent decisions. And I think especially in innovation, which has a kind of passion and value to it for many people, the emotional side of it is critical to include in innovation.
Yeah, really, problem solving, as some of you already know, is about the fact that the brain processes emotions and logic and rationality at the same time. And so it's about making sure that we understand which emotions help and which emotions hinder. So we need to know when we're on a roll with respect to our problem solving, and when we're plagued by things like the temptation to avoid or worry, or get stuck.
So maybe you can think right now about a problem you're facing at work and ask yourself, have I been approaching this in a more rational or logical or cognitive way? And are there some emotions that I need to have handled before I can really make my way through this problem effectively? Dave points to ideas like worry or fear. And I think that's one of what we're trying to point to here is when you're solving a problem and there's fear that your leadership won't support it or your peers won't support it, or just that you'll be kind of rejected, which I've just been hearing a lot from people lately in these EQ debriefs, that have a lot of fear about stepping outside the norms of the culture, even if they're not functioning well.
What emotions come to you when you think about those challenging work situations or challenging work problems? What emotions come to you? Feel free to type those in the chat box now. I can think of a few. How about you?
Yeah, for sure. In fact, it's rarely the cognitive aspect of it that's the problem, of the problem solving. It's often the emotion that gets...
Yeah, even just, having a couple of different options to choose between. I start to get a bit anxious.
I feel a little anxiety.
I want to make sure that I choose the right one. It's important to me.
Right.
So Grace has said excitement, anticipation, energy, absolutely. Thanks, Maynard. Anxiety, absolutely, right? It's like, am I going to make the right decision here? Am I going to...
Yeah, and if you're working in a higher risk adverse organization and they've given you the kind of reluctant go ahead to work on a project, the anxiety around sort of tackling any of the problems around that, or even taking them to the team, there might be a lot of feelings around that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So again, we've done this in our workshops, and here's something that came up in a workshop of Jill's.
Yeah, I think, what we're trying to invite people to do is think about some of the emotions that are getting in the way of tackling a problem, and then help people imagine what would it feel like to have this problem solved, and then how do you get from A to B, from the place of emotions derailing or undermining the project or problem to a place of imagining a positive outcome, both from a product and process perspective. And so, it's an interesting experience for people, because I think we tend to think of problem solving as a pretty linear and rather than emotional process.
And Grace has said it will depend on the type of personality of the person facing challenge. Yeah, absolutely. When we hear personality, we sometimes think of those fixed characteristics, and with EQ, we really want to support the notion that all of these things can be improved. So if you happen to be introverted and there's a group problem solving process, you want to ensure that you develop your abilities in other areas, which we're going to talk about right now. So thanks, Grace. That was a nice segue into our next piece here.
And yet I still want to say more.
Go ahead, Jill.
Well, I think it's also what you're pointing to, which is so interesting, is that it's both the individual and the culture. Again, I'm trained as a sociologist, so I'm always looking and thinking systems. So even if you have the kind of personality that gets excited about tackling a problem, if you're working in a punitive environment, a high consequence environment, an organization where fear kind of drives things, even if your own personality wants to take that on, there will be some real barriers to that. So I'm always thinking not just about the personality of the person or the tendencies of the person, but also the system that they're working in.
And thanks, Janie, for the comment. I think the emotional process is super important. Thanks for including that piece. And I want to talk a bit more about that because, as you may recall, these 3 EQ competencies were correlated with innovation. And we just want to take a quick look, and in the description of this webinar, I think I promised you 3 tips. Here they are. So the first one is independence, and it's interesting to think about independence in this process. Really, we first and foremost, we need to be able to think for ourselves. We need to not be overly influenced by others. And again, if we're relating this with leadership, this is about thinking for yourself, acknowledging the input of others, but thinking for yourself.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one, because very frequently on the EQI, on people's EQI results, they score relatively low on independence, and they're surprised by that. And there's two elements to that. One is that they may in fact just be in a culture that's preventing them from being able to express their ideas and themselves. But the other is that they tend to be more collaborative. And so the opposite of independence isn't necessarily dependence. It's a kind of mix between collaboration and then still this notion of being able to think and speak when necessary, even when it goes against the norms or the group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. Thanks, Jill. Let's talk about flexibility for a moment. And here's your tip: be open to the ideas of others. We do a funny exercise where we ask people about their perspectives on certain things, and then we ask them about their willingness to change their mind. And it's interesting to think about how tightly we hold on to our ideas, or whether we're flexible enough to be open to the ideas of others, which would be important in, say, a group innovation process.
You may have gathered that Dave and I are also life partners as well as work partners, and I'm laughing because we score differently on flexibility, and these webinars are often the challenge too. These 3 things are, the circle of independence, flexibility, and assertiveness, and we kind of need to keep that sliding scale open to.
It's important to speak up when you don't agree with something, right, Jill? And of course,
not my problem.
Again, and in a group process, again, working as a team, working in a collaborative environment, working with others, it's really important to develop these 3 areas so that we can fully participate in the process of innovation. So that, again, we make sure that we make our contribution, that we find our voice. I sometimes think about assertiveness as finding our voice. And we all need to do that. We all need to see, and some of the interconnections here, some of the connections that are not correlated with innovation specifically, but are also important, are self-regard. The idea that you matter, that what you have to say is worthwhile, that you deserve to be at the table. All of these things are also tightly interconnected here with innovation as well.
I think, again, one of the things that we really like about the EQI is that we don't help people just understand each of these, the 15 competencies in the model separately, but how they work together. And it's partly why we put this model together like this, just to demonstrate, if you score high on flexibility and low on assertiveness, for example, what's that character look like for you? So you're really accommodating, but you're not saying what you need. And that can lead to feeling taken advantage of, feeling, that you're too patient, you're too flexible, and that you actually have some ideas that you're sitting on, and that can build resentments in individuals and in organizations. Similarly, with independence, if you're low on independence and low on assertiveness, you're not letting the team know who you are and know what your ideas are. So you're going to be lower as a contributor on the team. So you can begin to see that we're building this profile of who an innovator is, and how an innovation culture gets developed is by the hiring practices, paying attention to these kinds of qualities in people.
Yes, absolutely. And Julianne points out that's placation, placators, perfectionists, a passive behavior style. Absolutely. So it is about a balance of these things. It's not about having everything high necessarily, or and also that high is not always better. It's about a balance.
Right, because high assertiveness and high independence, anybody worked with a leader like that before? And low flexibility. So again, just trying to point to, And these are not fixed states. These are very context specific and role
Yes.
specific, and they can all be developed.
Mm-hmm.
And so our goal in doing EQ debriefs with individuals is to really help them give some story and meaning around each of their scores,
Mm-hmm.
and see how they're interacting together. We often use the idea of a music board, and sometimes people are really turned up on, say,
mixing board.
Yeah. Yeah. So they've turned up certain things, like they've turned up flexibility and they've turned down assertiveness. It's like, what happens if, in a coaching session, what happens if you push that assertiveness up? And we give them a couple of different models to work with. And what happens if you turn up your independence? And what is it that you need to say? And so it's a very dynamic model, and it gets people out of the thinking that that's just who they are. They actually see the huge potential for developing all 15 aspects. I think I said this in one of the other webinars that we did, but a while ago when I was doing a debrief with somebody in the grocery industry, he said, "Oh, it's like taking the same meal to every potluck. If you have 2 or 3 competencies that you lean on, it's like, what happens when you develop more of the competencies?" And it's part of innovation at an individual level, as you start to think about yourself differently. You're not in that box of I'm an F or I'm a like.
We need to innovate ourselves.
Yeah.
I just have to comment on comment that came in. So Grace says organizational culture goes from the top. Unfortunately, the higher at the top, the lower the EQ. We actually don't have data to support that, Grace, but you may be right about some organizations, but of course that doesn't hold consistently across organizations. Sometimes we find some brilliantly emotionally intelligent people at the top of organizations.
But it sounds like you're pointing to what lots of people do, which is, it is very frustrating. We get lots of people coming to our courses that aren't at the very top, that are trying to influence up.
They say my boss should be in this course, and of course their boss should be in the course, but they're not. So then we talk about what's possible. There's one last competency that we want to talk about with respect to innovation, and it's just so important, and it's just, I think so critical to innovation, and it's this remaining hopeful and resilient. We're actually, we've got a couple of client organizations where people are a bit jaded, and it's kind of unfortunate to hear them talk about how they've been kind of beaten down by the lack of support and encouragement and optimism,
let alone
that things can change.
Inspiring leadership.
So we need to zero in and work on this idea of being hopeful and resilient.
And you can see how that in particular is related to innovation. That if people stopped at the first failure of a new idea, we would never get where we are. And so it's a very, this is not about being overly positive. It's about locating your hopefulness in real material terms, in real life, and knowing or believing that there's always a solution, that there's always a way through it, and that you don't do it alone, but you handle adversity and setbacks in a risk-supported environment.
So critical and important for leaders to make it a safe environment to take risks, to model this optimistic behavior, to support others so they can feel they can try, they can make mistakes, they can bounce back, etc. Grace just said, about the, in response to the comment about we don't have data to support this. I think I know what you're talking about, Grace. Ruben Barone measured this. There are some studies that look at certain groups of leaders, and I think you're talking about the bull in the china shop leader, the type of leader that creates the organization, but really in terms of their EQ, various aspects of EQ are a bit lower for them, and so they are hard on people, and they are sometimes smart enough to have people who who come along behind them and clean up the messes that they make in terms of relationship. So I think that may be what you're talking to. But we get to work with all kinds of leaders in our work, and so we can't categorically say that leaders at the top of organizations have low EQ. So that's our anecdotal experience, and in any case.
Yeah, I think what is true is when leaders at the top have low EQ, that absolutely affects the whole organizational culture. But I don't think it's as clear that all leaders at the top have lower EQ.
Yeah. Okay, so let's open it up to Q&A. Maybe a quick summary. So the focus of this webinar was innovation and looking at how it relates with both emotional intelligence and leadership, and then we looked at some of the EQ competencies that relate to.
Yeah. So again, just a reminder of the 4 we've covered: authenticity, coaching.
Oh, in the leadership model.
Yeah,
okay.
In the leadership model.
Sorry.
I'm sure we have authenticity, coaching, insight, and now innovation. So there's 4 dimensions of leadership, and the idea in these dimensions is that when you develop the competencies, you develop that dimension of your leadership capacity, and that's what leads to great leadership. And so the EQ model is more granular in a sense that we go from really developing the skills to developing the qualities to developing the dimension of leadership to really developing full inspirational leaders. And so this was the 4th of the 4 dimensions.
Yeah, so please feel free to type in your questions into the chat box there. We're happy to take
questions or comments.
Happy to take questions, happy to take comments, and hear some of your thoughts on some of the ideas that we've shared with you today.
And thanks for jumping in all along. It's
nice
from
to
this side
hear from everybody.
Where we can't see you as our
Yeah.
audience. It's nice to hear from you.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so there's not a lot of questions. So if you don't know much about us, we have a little company called the Emotional Intelligence Training Company, and we offer the certification course to certify people to use the EQI. We create customized learning events for organizations. So a couple of comments. My first webinar was great. Thanks, Ronnie. Really appreciate the comment. Clarencia, what should we do when we're having a boss who doesn't understand that too many challenging work situation can cause us frustration, etc.? Yeah, it's such a common comment, yeah. Clarencia. We hear this from many of our coaching clients. We encourage people to use a variety of tactics. So of course every situation is different. Jill, do you want to comment on that one?
Well, I think first of all, we get it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it's just, I think, well, they should come to our leadership course, but
yeah.
in the absence of that, it's so interesting to be in that position. And, we're constantly, our narrative is always that we're trying to shift, along with many others, the conversation of leadership as power to leadership as collaboration and connection and empathy and being trustworthy. And if people haven't been exposed to that paradigm of leadership, it's going to be very hard to really have an engaged or meaningful conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, my own thinking about power is that when you hit that kind of power, you're probably never really going to make much of a dent in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and our notion of leadership is that it is available to everyone. That we encourage everyone to demonstrate leadership behaviors, and.
So we have another question here, a comment. I like it. How do you address the emotional issues that surface with change without it feeling like therapy at work? Yeah, well, it doesn't need to be therapy. It just needs to be part of the conversation. It sounds like you're feeling really pissed off about that. Let's talk about that, because it's going to get in the way of our process and our product here. Or being able to say, like, this is, in boundaries, at work. I'm not okay with that happening. You don't have to, it's not therapy. And I think it's an interesting kind of fear that people have around emotional intelligence, is it's going to be way more about the like dealing with the emotions rather than knowing the emotions. And I think from our perspective, it really is about knowing and taming and utilizing, leveraging those emotions. It's data that often lays dormant and then derails processes because we think we've left them at the door before we step into work. But oh, there they are, as we all know. So really we want to bring them to the surface, know them for ourselves. And that's what emotional intelligence is intelligently using our emotions for good.
Thanks, everyone. We're going to sign off now, and please stay in touch. We love to hear from you, and you can see our email addresses at the bottom. Visit our website and join us on future webinars.
Great.
Thanks.
Bye for now. Enjoy
Bye, everybody.
the snow.